It started as a simple road trip. I was heading to a remote cabin in Nadera to clear my mind, taking a break from the chaos of my daily life. The roads twisted through dense forests, the trees growing taller and closer together the further I drove. The Jeep's GPS signal flickered in and out, but I had a printed map to rely on, a relic from a simpler time. It was supposed to be a straightforward journey, but a wrong turn took me off the beaten path. My name is Decker Maitland, and I'd like to think of myself as a pragmatic guy. I've seen my share of weird things, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that day. The road I turned onto was narrow and overgrown, more of a dirt trail than an actual road. I should have turned back, but curiosity got the better of me. After all, I was on an adventure. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy light that filtered through the canopy of leaves overhead. An hour passed before I realized I was completely lost. My map was useless in this dense network of unmarked paths. The only option was to keep driving and hope to find a way out. As I drove, I noticed a sign nailed to a tree, weathered and barely legible: Sullivan's Gulch, 2 miles. Figuring it was better than nothing, I headed towards Sullivan's Gulch. The path grew rougher, my car bouncing over rocks and roots. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a clearing up ahead. The trees parted to reveal a small, dilapidated village. It looked like something out of a horror movie. Wooden shacks with peeling paint, overgrown yards, and an eerie silence hanging in the air. I parked the car and stepped out, hoping to find someone who could give me directions. As I walked through the village, it felt deserted, the air heavy with the smell of decay. Then I heard it, a faint rustling behind one of the shacks. I called out, but no one responded. My curiosity pushed me forward. Around the corner of the shack, I froze. There, huddled in the shadows, was a man. He was filthy, his clothes tattered and stained. His eyes darted around wildly, and he mumbled incoherently. When he saw me, he scrambled back, fear evident in his every movement. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. "No, get away, they'll find you," he screamed before bolting into the forest. His words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't just leave. I needed to know what was going on. I continued through the village, more alert now. The buildings seemed to close in on me, their broken windows like empty eye sockets. A faint noise caught my attention, a low, rhythmic thudding coming from one of the larger buildings at the end of the street. It was an old community hall, the sign barely hanging on its rusted hinges. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, rotting meat and something metallic like blood. The hall was dark, but I could make out shapes hanging from the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with horror what they were: bodies. Human bodies strung up like pieces of meat in a butcher's shop. Some were fresh, others decomposing, all in various states of mutilation. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but stopped short when I heard voices outside. Peeking through a crack in the wall, I saw them. People, or rather creatures that were once people. They were grotesque, their features twisted and deformed, inbred cannibals, living in isolation and feeding on whoever was unfortunate enough to stumble upon their village. I needed to get out, but the front door was no longer an option. I crept towards the back of the hall, praying for an escape route. I found a small window and managed to squeeze through, dropping into the overgrown weeds outside. Keeping low, I moved towards the forest, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the village. I heard their guttural voices behind me, shouting and whooping as they realized someone was in their territory. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm and move quietly. The forest was dense, and I hoped it would provide enough cover to evade them. I stumbled upon an old hunting cabin, half collapsed but still offering some shelter. Inside, I found a rusty shotgun with a few shells. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I loaded the gun and waited, listening for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed and I began to think I might have escaped. Just as I was about to relax, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I gripped the shotgun, ready for whatever came through the door. A figure appeared in the doorway, and I fired without hesitation. The blast echoed through the trees, and the figure crumpled to the ground. I approached cautiously, shotgun still raised. It was one of them, a man with a twisted, feral face. His eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly. I kicked the body aside and looked outside. The commotion had attracted more of them. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, shouting to each other. I needed to keep moving. I grabbed a few supplies from the cabin, some old canned food, a hunting knife, and set off again. I followed the sound of running water, hoping it would lead me to safety. The forest seemed endless, and every snap of a twig made my heart race. As night fell, I found myself on the edge of a deep ravine. There was no way across, and I could hear them closing in behind me. Desperation took over. I scrambled down the steep slope, nearly losing my footing several times. At the bottom, I found a narrow cave, barely visible in the darkness. I squeezed inside, pulling some branches over the entrance to conceal myself. I sat in the darkness, clutching the shotgun and listening to their voices above me. They were searching, but the night and the terrain seemed to be on my side. Hours passed and the voices faded. Exhaustion took over and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I awoke, it was dawn. I cautiously emerged from the cave, my body aching and covered in scratches. The forest was silent. I climbed back up the ravine and continued my journey, driven by the hope that I might find a way out. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a dirt road. It was overgrown, but clearly a path people once used. Following it, I eventually reached a main road. Relief washed over me as I flagged down a passing car. The driver, an elderly man named Frank, looked at me with wide eyes as I climbed into his truck. I must have looked like hell, dirty, bloodied, and exhausted. I told him about the village, the cannibals, everything. He listened quietly, then nodded. "I've heard stories about Sullivan's Gulch," he said. "People go missing in those woods. You're lucky to be alive." He took me to the nearest town, where I called the authorities. They launched an investigation and the village was raided. What they found confirmed my story. Bones, bodies, and the remains of countless victims. The cannibals were either captured or killed, their reign of terror finally over. The end of the ordeal came with no fanfare, just the quiet satisfaction of having survived. I didn't dwell on it, didn't let it haunt me. I was just grateful to be alive. It started as a casual road trip, a much-needed break from the monotony of everyday life. I had decided to drive from Phoenix to Flagstaff, Arizona, a route I'd taken a few times before. My name is Caleb Drummond, and I'd been working long hours at a tech startup, so a day off was a rare luxury. The plan was simple: enjoy the scenic drive, maybe stop for a hike, and then return, refreshed and ready to tackle the next week. Leaving Phoenix behind, the cityscape slowly gave way to the rugged beauty of the Sonoran Desert. The road was a ribbon of asphalt cutting through cacti and rocky outcrops. I had music blasting, windows down, and the wind whipping through my hair. It felt good to be out, to have nothing but the open road ahead. As I drove further north, the landscape changed, becoming greener and more forested. The desert faded into memory, replaced by tall pines and the cooler air of the Coconino National Forest. It was around this point that I made my first mistake. I decided to take a detour. An almost forgotten road sign indicated a scenic route through the forest. It wasn't on my map, but it promised stunning views, and I couldn't resist. The narrow road twisted and turned through the dense forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. It was beautiful, serene even, but the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There were no other cars, no signs of human presence, Just me and the road winding deeper into the wilderness. An hour passed, then another, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I started to feel uneasy. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I hadn't seen any of the scenic viewpoints the sign had promised. My cell phone signal was long gone, and the gas gauge was creeping towards empty. It was time to turn around and head back, but the forest had other plans. The road, which had seemed so clear earlier, now appeared to be a labyrinth of identical trees and bends. Every turn felt like a repeat of the last, and soon I realized I was hopelessly lost. Panic began to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. I drove on, hoping to find some landmark or sign of civilization. Instead, I found something far more disturbing. A dilapidated cabin, barely visible from the road, hidden among the trees. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, and the whole place exuded an air of abandonment. Desperation drove me to stop and investigate. Maybe there was a map or at least some clue about where I was. I parked the car and approached the cabin cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, thick with dust and neglect. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. The interior was sparse, just a few broken pieces of furniture and a fireplace filled with ash. On a rickety table, I found something that made my blood run cold. A stack of old, yellowed newspapers. The headlines spoke of missing persons, hikers who had vanished in this very forest over the past few decades. I grabbed a few of the newspapers and stuffed them into my backpack, my mind racing with questions. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. Markings on the floor, scratches and gouges that led to a trap door in the corner of the room. My curiosity wrestled with my sense of self-preservation, but eventually, curiosity won. I pulled the trap door open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. With my phone's flashlight as my only guide, I descended into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small, dimly lit room. Chains hung from the walls, and in the center of the room was a crude wooden table. On it lay a collection of knives and tools, all stained with rust, and something darker. I backed away, horrified, and stumbled over something on the floor. It was a human skull, half buried in the dirt. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, only to be met with the sound of footsteps above. Someone was in the cabin. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself invisible. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. A figure appeared in the dim light, a man with a wild, unkempt beard and filthy clothes. He was carrying a large knife, and his eyes scanned the room, searching. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. He moved to the table, picking up one of the knives and inspecting it. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. I waited until he turned his back, then bolted up the stairs. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the cabin, and I heard him shout behind me. I burst through the door and ran for my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the man's shouts fading into the distance. But my ordeal was far from over. The road, which had seemed so confusing before, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. Every turn seemed to bring me back to the same spot, the cabin looming in the distance like a malevolent beacon. I drove in circles, the trees closing in around me until I finally ran out of gas. Night fell and I was stranded. I locked myself in the car, clutching the knife I had taken from the cabin as a last-ditch means of defense. The darkness was absolute, and the forest seemed to come alive with every rustle and crack of a branch. Sleep was impossible, fear keeping me on high alert. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. I held my breath, praying they would pass by, but they stopped right next to the car. I could see a shadow through the window, and then a face pressed against the glass. It was him, the man from the cabin. His eyes were wild, and his breath fogged up the glass as he stared at me. I screamed and swung the knife, shattering the window. The man recoiled but didn't retreat. He reached through the broken glass, grabbing at me. I slashed at him with the knife, cutting deep into his arm. Blood sprayed and he howled in pain, but his grip was like iron. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, I kicked the door open, throwing him off balance. I tumbled out of the car and ran, the forest a blur around me. Branches whipped at my face and the ground seemed to shift under my feet, but I didn't stop. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, his curses growing louder. I stumbled into a clearing, my lungs burning, and saw something that gave me hope. A ranger station, its lights a beacon in the darkness. I sprinted toward it, screaming for help. The door flew open and a ranger stepped out, his flashlight blinding me. Behind him, I saw the comforting sight of other people, safety. The man from the cabin burst into the clearing, his knife raised. The ranger drew his gun and fired. The man fell, his body collapsing into the grass. I collapsed too, the adrenaline leaving my body in a rush. The rangers surrounded me, their voices a comforting murmur as they assessed my injuries and called for backup. In the aftermath, the police uncovered the gruesome truth. The man was part of a family of inbred cannibals who had lived in the forest for generations, preying on lost hikers and travelers. The cabin was a horror show of human remains and evidence of their depraved acts. The newspapers I had found were a small part of their twisted collection, trophies of their victims. They found the remains of dozens of people, some dating back decades. The family had hidden their crimes well, the remote location of the cabin ensuring that their dark secrets remained buried for years. But now the truth was out, and the forest could begin to heal from the horrors that had lurked within its shadows. As for me, I was taken to a hospital, treated for my injuries, and questioned by the authorities. The ordeal was over, but the memories would stay with me. I was lucky to be alive, and I knew that many others hadn't been so fortunate. As the sun rose, casting light on the forest that had once seemed so impenetrable, I knew I'd never forget the events of that day. The nightmare was over, but the scars, both seen and unseen, would remain. The crumbling roads of New Hampshire can lead you to some peculiar places. Last summer, I ended up in one such place, and I haven't quite gotten over it. My name is Dean Barrett, and I've spent most of my life working odd jobs, scraping by in a world that often feels like it's spinning too fast for someone like me. I figured a solo camping trip in the White Mountains would do me some good. Clear my head, you know. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Pack the essentials, drive up, hike a bit, and spend a few nights under the stars. But things never go as planned. About halfway through my drive, I noticed the GPS signal on my phone was acting up. No big deal, I thought. I had a paper map in the glove compartment. But as luck would have it, I managed to take a wrong turn somewhere around a little town called Warren. The town itself was nothing special, just a collection of tired old houses and a single general store. I stopped there to ask for directions and stock up on some supplies. The store was run by an elderly man, Hank, who looked like he hadn't left that spot in decades. He gave me a strange look when I mentioned my destination. "You're heading up to the White Mountains, eh? Watch yourself, son. People get lost up there." "Thanks, I'll be careful," I said, thinking he was just trying to spook an out-of-towner. Hank gave me a toothless grin and wished me luck. With fresh supplies and a vague sense of unease, I set off again. This time I was sure I was on the right path. The road narrowed, trees closing in from both sides as I drove deeper into the forest. An hour later, my car started sputtering and eventually came to a stop. Out of gas. I could have sworn I filled the tank before I left, but there I was, stranded. I decided to hike the rest of the way to a campsite I had seen marked on the map. I grabbed my backpack, locked the car, and set off down the road. The forest was dense, the kind that seems to swallow you whole. After about 2 miles, I found a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the woods. Figuring it was a shortcut, I followed it. The path twisted and turned, and after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a clearing. At first, I was relieved to see a few wooden cabins. Maybe I could get some help, or at least directions. But as I approached, relief turned to unease. The place looked abandoned, or so I thought. The first cabin I approached had its door slightly ajar. I called out, but there was no response. Inside, the air was musty, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd, fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. Before I could react, I heard a noise from outside. I stepped out and saw a man standing by the edge of the clearing. He was tall, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He was holding a shotgun, pointed casually at the ground. "Lost, are you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, my car broke down. I'm trying to find my way to the campsite," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment before motioning with his gun. "Campsite's that way, but you should turn back. These woods aren't safe." I thanked him and started walking in the direction he pointed, but something felt off. I glanced back and saw him watching me, a cold expression on his face. I picked up my pace, heart pounding in my chest. The path he directed me to led further into the woods, and soon I was hopelessly lost. As the sun began to set, I knew I needed to find shelter. I stumbled upon another cabin, this one with smoke rising from its chimney. My gut told me to keep moving, but exhaustion and fear overrode my instincts. I knocked on the door and a woman answered. She was middle-aged, with a kind face that seemed out of place in these eerie woods. Come in," she said, ushering me inside. "You look like you've had a rough day." Grateful, I stepped into the warmth of the cabin. She introduced herself as Mabel and offered me some food. As I ate, she asked me about my trip and how I ended up there. I told her everything, and she listened intently. "You should be careful," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "There are dangerous people in these woods, folks who don't take kindly to strangers." I nodded, the unease growing stronger. After dinner, Mabel showed me to a small room where I could rest. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest and the creaking of the old cabin. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard hushed voices coming from the main room. I crept to the door and cracked it open, straining to hear. Mabel was speaking with someone and her voice was full of worry. "Can't stay here. He'll find out. We need to do something," she said. A man replied, his voice too low to make out. My heart raced. Who were they talking about? What did they mean? Suddenly, the front door burst open and the man with the shotgun stormed in. He was followed by 2 others, equally disheveled and menacing. They grabbed Mabel and the man she was talking to, dragging them outside. I watched in horror as they tied them to a post in the clearing. "You thought you could hide him from us," the man with the shotgun snarled. "You know what happens to traitors." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were going to kill them. I had to do something, but what? I was unarmed and outnumbered. As I wrestled with my fear, one of the men struck Mabel across the face with the butt of his gun. Blood poured from a gash on her forehead. I couldn't just stand there. I had to try and save them. I crept back into the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a heavy candlestick on the nightstand. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Clutching the candlestick, I moved silently through the cabin and slipped out the back door. The men were too focused on their victims to notice me. I crept up behind the closest one and swung the candlestick with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man dropped to the ground. The other two spun around, shock and rage on their faces. Before they could react, I charged at the second man, but he was quicker than his friend. He blocked my attack and punched me hard in the stomach. I doubled over, gasping for air. Just then, a gunshot rang out. The man with the shotgun staggered, a look of surprise on his face before he crumpled to the ground. Mabel stood behind him, holding a small pistol with shaking hands. She must have grabbed it from inside while I was distracting the others. The last man turned to run, but Mabel fired again, hitting him in the leg. He fell, screaming in pain. I grabbed his gun and pointed it at him, my hands shaking. "Don't move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glared at me but stayed where he was. Mabel and I untied the man from the post, her brother, Jacob. He thanked us, and we helped him inside to tend to his wounds. The man on the ground kept shouting for help, but no one came. As dawn broke, we knew we had to get out of there. We took the shotgun and the pistol and headed back to the road. Mabel led the way, her face set with determination. Jacob limped beside her, leaning on me for support. We walked for hours until we finally reached a small town. The locals were shocked by our story and called the police. They took our statements and went to investigate the cabin. The bodies were still there, just as we had left them. I never found out what happened to the rest of that family, but I don't care to know. I just want to forget that place and what I saw. But some things you can't unsee. They stay with you, lurking in the back of your mind, no matter how hard you try to forget. It was one of those unplanned road trips, the kind you take when you need to get away from everything familiar and breathe some new air. My name's Brent Harrison, and I was just looking for a bit of peace and solitude, something you don't get much of back in New York City. I had decided to explore the Appalachian backroads, hoping for serene views and maybe a few nights of camping. The kind of trip where you let the road take you where it wants. The sun was high, casting long shadows on the dense forests lining the winding roads. I had been driving for hours, enjoying the quiet and the sound of my tires on the gravel. No GPS, just an old map I had picked up at a gas station a few towns back. I felt like an explorer in uncharted territory, a feeling that was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. As the day stretched on, I found myself on a narrow, overgrown path. The map indicated it was a shortcut to the main highway, but it seemed like no one had used it in years. Bushes and tree branches encroached on the path, and the further I went, the less sure I was of my decision. Still, I pressed on, convinced that adventure lay just around the corner. Then the road ended, just like that. No warning, no signs, just a dense thicket that my car couldn't possibly get through. I sighed, realizing I'd have to turn back. As I was maneuvering my car to make the tight turn, I noticed something odd. A narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind a curtain of vines and foliage. Curiosity got the better of me. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack with some essentials, and decided to follow the trail on foot. The air was cooler here, shaded by the thick canopy of leaves above. It was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I walked for what felt like an hour, the trail winding deeper into the forest. I was just about to turn back when I heard it. A faint rustling noise, like something moving quickly through the underbrush. I froze, listening intently. The noise stopped and the silence returned, heavier than before. I continued a bit more cautiously now, and soon the trail opened up into a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. It looked abandoned. the kind of place that had stories etched into its very beams. My sense of adventure kicked in again, and I approached the cabin, curious about what I might find. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and decay. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The cabin was sparse, just a few pieces of broken furniture and some old, tattered curtains. It was obvious no one had lived here for a long time. As I explored, I noticed a trapdoor in the corner, slightly ajar. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't resist. I had to know what was down there. I lifted the door, revealing a set of narrow, rickety stairs leading into darkness. My flashlight flickered as I descended, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The basement was colder, the air thick with a musty odor. The walls were lined with shelves holding old jars and bottles, their contents long since dried up. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it lay what looked like ancient tools, rusty knives, saws, and other implements I couldn't identify. A chill ran through me as I realized these weren't just tools, they were instruments of torture. Before I could react, I heard footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate steps moving across the floorboards. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had found and who was in the cabin above me. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped, right above the trap door. I held my breath, praying whoever it was wouldn't come down. But then the trap door creaked open, and a beam of light pierced the darkness. I backed into the shadows, trying to make myself invisible. A figure descended the stairs, tall and broad, carrying a lantern. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see enough to know he wasn't someone I wanted to meet. The man moved to the table, placing the lantern down and inspecting the tools. He muttered to himself, words I couldn't quite make out. My mind raced, looking for a way out. The basement had no windows, no other exits. I was trapped. Just then, I noticed a small door at the back of the basement, partially hidden by a stack of old crates. It was my only chance. I moved as quietly as I could, inching toward the door. The man was still focused on the table, giving me a sliver of hope. I reached the door, pulling it open just enough to slip through. It led to a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through. I squeezed in, moving as fast as I could without making noise. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but I could see a faint light at the end. Finally, I emerged into another part of the forest, gasping for breath. I didn't stop to rest. I needed to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just that I needed to get away. As the sun began to set, I found myself on another trail, this one more well-worn. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small town. It was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. I made my way to the local diner, hoping to find someone who could help me. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals and the waitress behind the counter. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, came over. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. "More like a nightmare," I replied, my voice shaking. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "What brings you to these parts?" I told her a brief version of my story, leaving out the more gruesome details. She listened, her expression growing more concerned. "You need to talk to Sheriff Miller," she said when I finished. "He's the one who deals with this kind of thing." I nodded, feeling a bit more hopeful. "Where can I find him?" "He's usually at the station this time of day. It's just down the road. I'll call ahead and let him know you're coming." I thanked her and left, heading for the sheriff's station. The building was small, but it had an air of authority. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Sheriff Miller was waiting for me, a tall man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes. "Brent Harrison?" he asked, extending his hand. "Yes, sir," I replied, shaking his hand. "Margie called ahead," he said, motioning for me to sit. "Said you had quite the story." I recounted everything, this time not holding back. The sheriff listened intently, taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You're not the first to come across that cabin," he said finally. "We've had reports of people going missing in that area for years. Most folks steer clear, but some, well, curiosity gets the better of them." "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't know his name," the sheriff replied, "but we call him the Butcher. No one who's seen him up close has ever come back to tell the tale, until now." A shiver ran through me at the thought. "What do we do?" "We'll need to go back, gather evidence," the sheriff said, "but you've done enough. I'll take it from here." I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Get some rest," he said, standing up. "You've had a hell of a day." I left the station feeling lighter, but still haunted by what I had seen. The town seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the horrors hidden in the woods nearby. I found a small motel and checked in, collapsing onto the bed. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, I was woken by a knock on the door. It was Sheriff Miller. "We found the cabin," he said grimly. "And the tunnel you mentioned. It's worse than we thought." He handed me a cup of coffee and sat down. "We found remains, old and new. Looks like he's been at this for a long time." I felt a wave of nausea but forced myself to stay composed. "What happens now?" "We're bringing in a team, closing off the area," the sheriff said. "But I wanted to thank you. Without your help, we might never have found it." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. "I'm just glad I made it out." Sheriff Miller stood up. "Take care of yourself, Brent, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." I watched him leave, the weight of the past day finally settling on me. I had survived, but the memories would linger. The town returned to its quiet routine, but I knew the shadows held secrets that would never be fully uncovered. I always preferred the back roads, far from the endless lines of headlights and tail lights. I thought they were more interesting, offering a glimpse into parts of America that few people see. That's probably what saved me when my car broke down that night. It started with a sputtering noise, then a clunk, and my old sedan coasted to a stop. I cursed, pulled out my phone, and realized I had no signal. I wasn't far from town, maybe 10 miles back, but I didn't relish the idea of walking it in the dark. I looked around and noticed a faint light through the trees off to the right. "I'm in the middle of nowhere," I muttered to myself, thinking of my earlier argument with my wife about not getting the car serviced. Let's hope this light isn't just some hallucination. I decided to check it out, grabbing my flashlight and heading into the woods. The path was narrow, the trees close and oppressive. After about 15 minutes, I stumbled upon a clearing and a large, dilapidated farmhouse. The light was coming from inside. The place looked deserted and rundown, but the light suggested someone was home. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty night. "Hello, my car broke down and I need help," I called out, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. The door creaked open, and a man with a long, scraggly beard and wild eyes peered out. He was tall and gaunt, wearing tattered overalls. He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Car troubles, huh? Come on in. Name's Eli," he said, stepping aside. I hesitated, but then stepped inside, immediately assaulted by the smell of rot and decay. The house was a mess. Old newspapers, broken furniture, and filth covered the floor. Eli led me into the living room where two other men sat, looking just as rough as Eli. "This is my brothers, Noah and Jeb," Eli said, pointing to them. They nodded but didn't say anything. "We can help you fix your car in the morning. Got plenty of tools." I forced a smile, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread. "Thanks, I appreciate it." "No problem," Eli said, motioning to a sagging couch. "Make yourself comfortable." I sat down, gingerly, feeling the springs poke through the worn fabric. The brothers continued to stare at me, their eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "So where are you from?" Eli asked, leaning against the wall. "Just passing through, heading up to see some family," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. Eli nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really interested in my answer. There was something off about the whole situation, and I felt trapped. I needed to find a way out. "Got anything to eat?" "It's been a long drive," I said, hoping to get out of the living room. Sure, Eli said, nodding. "Follow me to the kitchen." I stood up and followed him down a narrow hallway, glancing at the peeling wallpaper and the cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. The kitchen was worse than the living room, with dirty dishes piled high in the sink and a foul odor permeating the air. Eli opened the fridge, revealing a collection of questionable leftovers. He grabbed a plate of what looked like meatloaf and handed it to me. I took it reluctantly, trying to hide my disgust. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. Eli watched me with an unsettling intensity as I took a small bite. The taste was rancid, and I struggled to swallow it without gagging. "Good, huh?" Eli asked, grinning. "Yeah, it's great," I lied as I forced down another bite. I noticed something odd about the meat. It didn't look like any meatloaf I had ever seen. My stomach churned, and I quickly put the plate down. "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom," I said, standing up. Eli pointed to a door down the hall. "Right there." I walked down the hall, my heart pounding. I needed to get out of there, but I had to find my way back to the road first. I entered the bathroom and locked the door behind me. The window was small, but I might be able to squeeze through it. I opened the window and climbed out, landing in the overgrown backyard. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I needed to get back to my car and get out of there. I moved quickly but quietly, staying close to the trees. As I approached the edge of the clearing, I heard voices behind me. I turned and saw Eli and his brothers standing on the porch, looking around. "Where'd he go?" Eli shouted, his voice filled with anger. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath. I waited until they went back inside before making my way to the road. I found my car and got inside, trying the ignition one more time. It was dead. "Shit," I muttered, looking around for any sign of help. I decided to walk back toward town, hoping to find a gas station or someone who could help. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in around me. Finally, I saw the glow of lights in the distance. I quickened my pace, my feet aching from the rough terrain. As I got closer, I saw that it was a small gas station. I stumbled inside, breathing a sigh of relief. "Can I help you?" the attendant asked, looking up from his magazine. "Yeah, my car broke down and I need a tow," I said, leaning against the counter. The attendant nodded and picked up the phone. "Sure thing. Where's your car?" "About 10 miles back on the old dirt road," I said. The attendant made a call, then looked back at me. "Tow truck will be here in about 30 minutes. You can wait here if you want." "Thanks," I said, sitting down on a bench near the window. As I waited, I thought about Eli and his brothers. There was something deeply unsettling about them, and I was glad to be away from their house. The tow truck arrived and the driver hooked up my car. I rode with him back to town, grateful to be moving again. As we drove, I glanced back at the road, half expecting to see Eli and his brothers following us. But there was nothing. When we reached the mechanic's shop, the driver dropped off my car and gave me a ride to a nearby motel. I checked in and collapsed on the bed, exhausted. I was safe for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. What had I eaten at Eli's house? And what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did? As I drifted off to sleep, I made a mental note to stick to the main roads from now on. Some back roads were better left unexplored. The next morning, I woke up early and called the mechanic to check on my car. He told me it would be ready by noon, so I had some time to kill. I decided to grab breakfast at a diner down the street. I walked in and sat at the counter, ordering a coffee and a stack of pancakes. The place was busy, filled with locals chatting and laughing. It felt good to be around people again. As I ate, I overheard a conversation between two men at the counter next to me. "Did you hear about the old farmhouse on the edge of town?" one of them asked. "Yeah, they found bodies there last night," the other replied, his voice low. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Bodies? Police think it was a family of cannibals living there," the first man said, shaking his head. "Sick bastards." I quickly paid my bill and left the diner, my heart pounding. I needed to get out of this town and never look back. When I got to the mechanic's shop, my car was ready. I paid the bill and got in, driving away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the town a distant memory. I knew I'd never forget what happened on that dark, lonely road, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. From that day on, I always made sure to take the main roads, no matter how boring they seemed.